Welcome to our fourth elective certificate program briefing, an economic analysis of infrastructure proposals. I'm Sophia. I'm the program coordinator at PWBM, one of the administrators of the certificate program and the face behind many an email. So glad to finally virtually see you all. Thanks for joining us today. I'm here with Jon Huntley, one of PWBM's senior economists, and he's going to be the instructor of today's course. So I'm going to pass it off to him. And as usual, you know the drill. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and we'll address them after the presentation. So take it away, Jon.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is, Sophia said, is Jon Huntley. I'm a senior economist with the Penn Wharton budget model, and I do the organization's infrastructure analysis, and I work on their overlapping generations model, which you may have learned about in an earlier session. So I'm going to talk today about how the Penn Wharton budget model provides analysis specifically for infrastructure programs. In order to perform our analysis, we need to be able to answer 5 questions. The first 4 questions inform our long-term analysis of the economic and budgetary effects from infrastructure spending. And the last question informs our estimates of the short-term effects on GDP from infrastructure spending. And we'll sort of cover that last question in the second half of the presentation. Okay. So here's our list of 5 important questions that we need to answer when we're talking about infrastructure spending. First, we need to understand how federal aid impacts state and local spending on infrastructure. When state and local governments get infrastructure spending, their behaviors, their budgets change, and we need to understand how. And in order to do that, we use studies on real-world state and local government data on spending, as well as federal aid to answer this question. Our second question is, we need to know how productive is infrastructure. So if we ask this another way, we're really asking how much new GDP or output does additional infrastructure create? How much new economic activity are we creating? Again, here we rely on a number of studies on real-world data on output and infrastructure investment to answer this question. Third, what we want to determine the budgetary and the budgetary effects from infrastructure proposals. To determine the effects of the infrastructure program on the budget, we use our calibrated model. Okay. Ultimately, the goal of infrastructure spending is designed to grow our economy or increase GDP. And so we want to know, will these infrastructure plans accomplish this? In order to learn this, we use our calibrated model, which includes infrastructure, or also known as public capital, and combine that with revenue estimates, real-world data on productivity, and real-world data on infrastructure investment in order to figure out whether or not a proposed policy is going to achieve our goal of increasing GDP. So when we started providing infrastructure analyses a few years ago, US GDP was close to potential GDP. In other words, our economy was strong. We were not in a recession. In this case, we didn't have much reason to expect that there would be much short-term increase to GDP from infrastructure spending, that most of the effect would be long-term as productivity increases began to be realized once the infrastructure was online and ready to go. Now, however, US GDP is far below potential because of the pandemic-related recession, so a well-timed infrastructure aid is likely going to affect GDP. We turn to studies on real-world data on the effects of fiscal stimulus, put another way, government spending, to determine how effectively infrastructure spending can deliver a short-term economic boost. Okay. The answers to all 5 of these questions will inform our analysis. First, we'll take a look at how much federal infrastructure aid results in total new public infrastructure. When the government gives out infrastructure aid, state and local governments adjust their behavior in response to this aid. The type of infrastructure aid, whether it comes in the form of grants, tax credits, or direct spending, has different effects on state and local government budgets and decision-making. Okay. So one way that the federal government can give out aid for infrastructure projects is with block grants or matching grants with caps. For example, if the federal government awarded $10 billion in aid to New Jersey to spend on roads, that would be a block grant. A matching grant with cap is a grant that requires states to contribute a certain percentage to a project, and also the grant has limits. So for example, a build grant used to require that states contribute at least 20% of the cost of a project. And the grant was limited to $25 million per project and $150 million per state. These types of grants have a smaller effect on total infrastructure spending than aid that lowers the cost of infrastructure investment, types of aid such as tax credits or loan programs. One example of these programs is TIFIA, which provides credit at rates lower than the market than state or local governments might be able to secure from private lenders. To see why states may behave differently from these programs, let's use a real-world example. Someone gives you a $10 gift card to the grocery store that you're going to go to anyway. You're going to spend that $10 gift card. But what were you going to do with the $10 in your pocket that you would have spent on groceries? Well, maybe that's going to savings now, maybe eating out, maybe a movie, maybe paying off debt. Since you're going to the grocery store anyway, that $10 gift card probably isn't going to make a big change in your spending habits at the grocery store. Now imagine that you got a large discount at the grocery store. Let's say you get 50% off anything you want to buy at the grocery store. Well, you were going there anyway, but now some purchases at the grocery store are a lot more tempting than they used to be. That premium cut of steak looks a lot more appealing than it did when it was twice as expensive. Baked goods at 50% off look a lot more delicious. At least maybe that's just me. Therefore, the point is that this type of discount, where you're lowering the price of a good, is much more likely to change your behavior than just a straight-up gift card. So studies of real-world data show that state and local governments respond to these incentives in the same way. There is a very large literature that tries to document exactly how much. In fact, recent Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler has written extensively on this topic. The literature shows that discounts that change the cost of infrastructure, programs such as tax credits or loan programs, or even matching grants that don't have caps on them, encourage states, local governments, and private organizations to invest more in infrastructure compared to programs such as block grants or matching grants with caps. The literature shows that both models of federal aid can and do increase total infrastructure investment, but that aid that changes the cost of infrastructure investment is going to do a much better job of boosting total infrastructure spending. So we use a large number of studies on state and local spending on infrastructure to develop a range of total infrastructure spending for every dollar of federal aid. So this table is going to show us for every dollar of federal aid how much new infrastructure you're actually going to get. So for example, if you're looking at block grant, our medium estimate is that for $1 of federal aid, actual total infrastructure investment will go up by 50 cents. Okay, the type of federal infrastructure aid, whether it comes in the form of grants, tax credits, or spending, has different effects on the state budgets and decision making. So block grants and matching grants with caps are like the grocery store gift cards. All of our real-world evidence suggests that the state and local governments will spend this gift card for infrastructure, but that some of the money they would have spent on infrastructure is going to go to other priorities. In the middle of our range, state and local governments spend 50 cents less of their money on infrastructure for every dollar of federal aid. So we end up with a total increase of 50 cents in total new infrastructure investment. Now, policymakers have spent a lot of time trying to design programs that restrict aid to new projects in an attempt to force states to maintain or even increase their infrastructure spending. Put another way, policymakers want total infrastructure spending to go up by more than the value of federal aid. They want the numbers on this table to be greater than $1. However, states are constantly coming up with new projects, and policymakers have not been successful in finding a way to design the grant programs to consistently distinguish between projects that would have been built and projects that would not have been built without aid. The real-world studies to this point are telling us that it's really hard without additional incentives to get states to increase their contribution to infrastructure spending. So now let's look at the loan programs or tax credits, which do provide this type of incentive for states to increase their spending. Although states are getting money for infrastructure investment like they were before, in this case, the cost of additional infrastructure investment actually becomes cheaper. A dollar in state or local government spending leads to more than a dollar's worth of new infrastructure investment. The literature shows that state and local governments have greater incentives to spend on infrastructure, which is shown in studies and is reflected in our higher range. So the range here is 50 cents to $1.50, compared to the block grants, which is 0 cents to $1. Another type of spending is direct spending, and that's when the federal government directly invests in programs such as national parks or Amtrak. This type of spending will probably not affect state and local spending on infrastructure. This is spending on things that the state is unlikely to finance on its own. The spending on Amtrak would, for example, would have very little impact on a state or local government's budget or decision-making process. Therefore, each dollar in federal outlays will end up as another dollar in infrastructure under most circumstances. The last type of grant I'd like to talk about are grants to distressed areas or economically distressed communities. These communities may not be able to borrow at competitive rates or raise taxes to build infrastructure. In this case, federal aid may have a greater impact on infrastructure spending because there are high-value projects that these communities haven't yet built. On the other side, however, these communities are not going to be able to contribute additional funds to infrastructure projects simply because it is hard for these municipalities to borrow money or raise taxes. Okay, so now we have estimates for how much infrastructure spending is going to increase in response to federal infrastructure aid. Infrastructure spending is really investment is a long and drawn out process. The next steps are to determine first how fast these projects are completed on average, and second, how productive these projects are and how much GDP they generate. The last thing we'll need in order to get a full picture of the long-term economic and budgetary effects of infrastructure investment is that we need to know how the federal government is going to pay for the infrastructure aid. With all of that information, we can estimate total long-term economic effects of these packages, and we will show you the results from some earlier PWBM analyses of infrastructure plans from 2018. Okay. So appropriating and awarding money is only part of the process of getting usable infrastructure. It takes time to find, develop, and plan the investments. And then once the money is being spent, it takes the time for the investment to be constructed or be completed. So even after designing and awarding contracts for a road, it may take years for that road to become drivable. Investments in education may take even longer. If an educational investment is in something like preschool, it could literally take decades before the investment begins to result in an increase in GDP. Using schedules of a wide range of projects developed by the Congressional Budget Office, we take the time to build and time to spend into account when determining the long-term economic effects of infrastructure investment. The figure on the right are two hypothetical build-out rates for infrastructure. The schedule on this graph has the standard published CBO schedule for new infrastructure, as well as an accelerated schedule, the red line, for use on shovel-ready projects, that is, projects that are ready to start almost immediately. The schedule includes the time to build for infrastructure projects. After the money is actually spent, almost half of the infrastructure invested is boosting productivity within about 4 to 5 years under the standard CBO schedule. However, if you look at that blue line, it takes nearly 20 years for all of the investment to come online or increase GDP. So now that we have the amount of total new infrastructure built and a schedule on which the projects are completed, we need to know how productive it is or how much GDP it creates. Most infrastructure investments are in public capital. Okay, so normally when we talk about capital, we talk about private capital, and private capital is owned by individuals or businesses. The income or output from private capital goes to the people who own it. By contrast, public capital is available to everyone. It raises the productivity of both labor and private capital. It complements both. So for example, if you build a new bridge that helps people get where they're going faster, a business is going to be able to move its goods with fewer trucks and fewer hours driving. So this business's labor, their drivers, and their private capital, their trucks, are both more productive. Another example may be if we built a new airport runway. This would allow more on-time departures, and this would make both airplanes and their crews more productive because they spend more time flying and less time sitting on the ground waiting their turn to take off. Now what we need to do is put numbers on these effects. So the question we're looking to answer is how much does each dollar of public investment increase GDP? To answer that, we look at the huge number of studies on real-world infrastructure spending and output to determine how effective these projects are at boosting GDP. Unfortunately, there are an equally large number of estimates of these productivities, and the values vary significantly by project. So we have to pick, on average, a value for productivity that falls in the middle of this vast literature and seems sensible. We chose a return of about 12% per year on public investment. And because public capital ages very slowly, that's about 12% return for many years to come. Put another way, for every dollar of new infrastructure capital, we would expect that to increase GDP by about 12 cents per year. To put that in perspective, in our model, the return is about 6% on private capital. That's things like trucks, machines, or computers. So in our analysis, public capital is going to be a bit more productive, or it is going to create more GDP than private capital. Okay, so in order to finish this analysis, we need to know how the infrastructure investment is being funded. A common way to fund infrastructure investment is through user fees. You can think toll roads, taxes on airline departures, docking fees for ships, train ticket sales, etc. This is a very common way to finance infrastructure investment, but it's not the only way the government finances infrastructure investment. Sometimes the government borrows money to build infrastructure. This approach is called deficit financing. The government increases its deficit or borrows more money in order to spend more on infrastructure aid. The downside to this approach is that when the federal government borrows money, it crowds out private investment. Money that was destined for private investment in productive capital is, in fact, diverted to the government spending. In the real world, an investor saves money. That money would have been invested in a business or a productive capital. They might buy stocks or something like that. But now these investments have to compete with additional government debt, which provides an alternate investment for the household. So the U.S. economy may end up with more public capital, but if the investment is deficit financed, the new debt will crowd out private capital, which leads to lower GDP and can offset the increases in GDP from new public infrastructure. Instead of borrowing money to build infrastructure, the federal government alternately could finance it with higher taxes on labor income. Okay. This includes things like payroll taxes and ordinary income taxes. In this case, the government is not borrowing money and is not crowding out private capital, but the higher labor taxes disincentivize households from working as much. In this case, we see labor going down, which offsets the GDP gains from the new investment in public capital. Another way to finance it, the government could be raising business or capital taxes. In this case, the government is not borrowing money, so it's not explicitly crowding out private capital. However, the higher capital or business taxes, capital taxes or business taxes create a disincentive for households to save or invest. In this case, investment in private capital will decrease as well. Lower private capital will lower GDP, possibly offsetting the gains from public infrastructure investment. So now that we've answered the first 4 of those 5 questions from the list in the beginning of the presentation, we have the tools we need to analyze the long-run effects of infrastructure investment. We know how federal spending is going to change state and local budgets. We have an estimate of how quickly the money is spent and how quickly the projects are built. We know roughly how productive the investments are, or at least an average productivity of investments. And we know how the investment is financed. So we're going to throw all these things together in our model, and we're going to come up with actual investments, actual estimates of the effects, the long-run effects of these infrastructure projects. So let me show you a couple of examples of how this would work. And we're going to go back to 2018. The White House and the Senate Democrats both introduced proposals for infrastructure funding. The White House plan called for $200 billion, mostly allocated to block grants, and there was some for matching grants with caps, and there was a small amount of money allocated to loan programs and borrowing subsidies. The White House plan isn't explicitly funded with any tax, but it does strongly emphasize state, local, and private development of new revenue sources. So in our analysis, we model these new revenue sources as user fees. One example of user fees on public infrastructure would be the tolls you might pay on highways. We talked about this a little earlier. User fees have one key advantage over the other types of funding, is that user fees are non-distortionary. What we mean by that is that user fees are not going to directly affect your take-home pay from work, or they're not going to directly affect your returns from investments. Unlike income taxes, which do directly affect your take-home pay from work or your return on investments, user fees are not going to discourage households from working or saving. So the Senate Democrat plan is much larger. It was about 5 times larger than the White House plan. The Senate Democrats call for slightly more than $1 trillion in infrastructure outlays spread out across matching grants with caps, loan programs and subsidies, tax credits, and various forms of direct spending. Using the approach we outlined before, we estimate that the total investment in new infrastructure is actually about $630 billion. And so that's what we're going to see in new infrastructure after the state and local governments adjust their budgets in response to federal aid. Unlike the White House plan, the Senate Democrats clearly articulate a source of revenues to fund their plan. They call for changes in both personal and corporate income taxes to fund their program. So unlike the White House plan, these taxes are explicitly distortionary. They are going to change households' take-home pay and returns on investment, and therefore we should expect some decline in household work and saving in response to their plan. Okay, so let's take a look at the results from the White House infrastructure plan. Now, this was we published this back in 2018. Our model has changed a little bit since then. We've updated a few of our estimates, so the numbers would change slightly, but overall the general picture is very, very similar. You'd see something similar today from a similar plan. Okay, so on the left side, we're going to look at the White House plan that's funded explicitly with user fees. And then for a comparison and to understand how all this works, we're going to look at the White House plan funded with higher deficits in the right panel. Okay, so I'm going to start by looking at GDP. That's output, and that's sort of our measure of the success of these programs here. And so on the left-hand side, we're going to start with the blue bars, which in many cases are barely visible. So we're going to look at the results in 2032. So the effect on GDP is very close to zero here. It's just barely positive. And so why is it zero? Well, we have two offsetting effects here. First, public capital goes up by about 0.6%. That's going to increase GDP. Public capital right now is about $10 trillion, and it'll be even more by 2032. So $125 billion that we're going to get out of the White House increase is just really not going to be that large. And precisely, it's going to be 0.6%. So public capital increases GDP, but private capital declines by a tiny amount as well. It sort of has to do with the timing of the user fees and the construction time. So that's going to go down just a tiny amount, which lowers GDP. These two effects cancel out and make it so that GDP is effectively unchanged. The plan is funded exactly with user fees, so there's no increase in debt. You can see debt is the fourth column there. Both of them are basically zero. Really, the rest of the really the rest of the economy is also unchanged. You can see that there's basically no change in wages or hours worked either. And a lot of this, and a lot of these zeros are just due to the fact that this is a pretty small plan. Okay, so alternately, the White House plan could be financed with higher deficits. You know, the government is going to issue additional debt to finance this plan, and we're going to show this in the right panel. So in 2032, similarly represented by the blue bars, GDP goes down by a small amount, in this case about 0.1%. So unlike the plan funded with user fees, private capital declines more when the plan is funded with higher deficits. This is because the debt, which is 0.7% higher, is crowding out private capital. A bigger drop in private capital is leading to a bigger negative effect on GDP in this scenario. As time goes on, and you can see in 2042 we have the orange bars, the effect from higher debt snowballs or increases, leading to additional crowding out. In 2042, the orange bars on private capital goes down by 0.5%, leading to a larger decline in GDP, although it still rounds to 0.1%. The decline in GDP still rounds to 0.1%. One additional effect from the deficit finance plan, is that there's a big negative effect on wages. In both cases, the decline in capital makes workers less productive. Take away my computer and I can't make slides for you anymore or give this presentation, and that's going to be reflected in my lower wages. Penn is not going to pay me as much because I'm less useful. You can see that in a small but noticeable decline in average wages, which go down by about 0.1% in both 2032 and 2042. Okay, so by comparison, the Senate Democrat infrastructure plan is much, much larger. And so these graphs are basically very, very similar. In fact, they're on exactly the same scale so that you can compare them to what we saw in the previous table, in the previous paragraphs. So the Senate Democrat infrastructure plan here is about $1 trillion in federal aid and $630 billion in new infrastructure capital. In the left panel, the plan funded with higher personal and corporate income taxes, GDP is effectively unchanged in 2032, as is shown in the bars. In the blue bars, it goes down a tiny bit, but is not meaningfully different from the baseline. GDP is unchanged because, like before, we have two competing effects. First, public capital increases GDP by increasing the productivity of labor and capital. In this case, public capital goes up by 5 times as much as it does in the White House plan, or 3%. Offsetting this effect, however, is a moderate decline in the level of private capital, and this comes about because now there are distortionary taxes on household savings. So compared to the White House plan, private capital declines more because debt is 1.0% higher and is crowding out private capital as well. So why is debt going up in this plan as compared to the White House plan? In the years through 2027, personal and corporate income taxes increase, as we noted earlier. This leads to a small decline in labor and saving, which leads to a small decline in GDP, which leads to a small decline in tax revenues. So the decline in revenues means that even though new revenues actually fall short of the expenditure of the Senate Democrats' expenditures. So even though the changes to personal and corporate income taxes expire in 2027, we have extra debt hanging around from all those years in which output and revenues declined. So this leads to a significant, or 0.6% decline in private capital in 2032. In the end, these two effects, higher productivity from more public capital and decreased output from lower private capital, offset each other. And the net effect on GDP is still negative, but very close to zero. The same story applies in 2042, the orange bars, except the bigger negative effects outweigh the positive effects and lead to a 0.2% decline in GDP. By 2042, the public capital is growing older and less effective. And crowd out is increasing over time, leading to a 0.9% drop in private capital. Now the net effect from the changes in public and private capital becomes negative. As before, wages fall as the drop in private capital makes workers less productive. Although the Senate Democrats hadn't proposed deficit financing, we also evaluated the Senate Democrat plan financed with additional borrowing. The effects on the economy are the same as those from the White House plan, just much, much larger. GDP drops by 0.3% in 2032, which is mostly due to the effects of a much larger 1.2% drop in private capital. Private capital drops so much because of the increased debt, nearly 4%, is crowding out much more private capital. The decline in private capital accelerates to 2.3% in 2042, which leads to a larger drop of 0.7% in both GDP and wages. Okay, so those are the two plans that we covered back in 2018. To this point, we've covered the long-term economic and budgetary effects of infrastructure investment. It takes a long time to spend on and build public infrastructure, so most of the productivity benefits from infrastructure investment are realized many years from the initial appropriation. Now we're going to take a look at the potential short-term effects on infrastructure investment. Does infrastructure investment have any short-term effects on GDP? Specifically, we're going to evaluate one of the calls for infrastructure investment during the 2020 pandemic recession, the Phase 4 coronavirus response. In addition to this proposal, House Democrats have advanced their own proposals, and the CARES Act had significant support for state and local budgets, some of which went to infrastructure investment. In our previous analysis of the 2018 White House and Senate Democrat plans, we did not find that there was any short-term change in GDP from either of their plans. But we do find a significant effect on short-term GDP in these types of plans in 2020. So the question is, what changed? The answer is that two things changed when actual GDP falls far below potential GDP, when we are in a recession. First, the federal, state, and local government budgets are thrown into turmoil. State and local governments are unlikely to react to federal infrastructure aid the same way as if the economy were not in recession or were at potential. Secondly, private businesses and people respond differently to federal infrastructure spending. These changes are reflected in changes in, quote, in the fiscal multipliers, or also known as the increase in GDP for each dollar of federal spending. So how do recessions affect state and local finance, and how does this affect their willingness to spend money on infrastructure? Recessions have a large impact on state and local government finances. In general, state and local governments have less flexibility to borrow than the federal government. So in an emergency, when revenues fall far below expectations because we're in a recession, and the state and local governments need to finance additional spending, like pandemic-related public health spending or other emergency public services, state and local governments are looking to cut any costs that they can, and infrastructure is high on the list. Ongoing projects may get delayed, and planned projects may get shelved until state and local government revenues recover and their spending needs abate. In this case, federal infrastructure grants can keep those projects from being cut. When the economy is at potential, $1 of federal infrastructure aid in the form of grants can lead to between $0 and $1 of total new infrastructure. We saw that earlier in the table we showed. Now, with the economy far below potential, the same dollar of federal aid in the form of a grant can lead to a full dollar worth of infrastructure spending. Nonetheless, the short-term effects only apply to shovel-ready projects or ongoing projects. If states have to plan and develop new infrastructure projects, the money will almost certainly not be spent until the recession is over and GDP is back at potential. Therefore, these increased effects on infrastructure spending would only apply to as much as $300 billion in federal infrastructure aid per year. More money than that would have no short-term GDP effect because there are no more projects that could be immediately started and employ large numbers of workers. Okay, so how does this work? If up to $300 billion is being spent, what will the short-term economic effects be? Well, let's start about thinking about this in normal times. When GDP is close to potential, the answer is probably not much. A government infrastructure investment is going to use resources that would have otherwise been used by the private sector. In a low unemployment economy, like we were used to before the pandemic began in March this year, Using a worker to build a bridge, a government-financed bridge, means that this worker is not going to be able to build something else, like an apartment building or a house. Resources get moved around, but the short-term total economic effect is fairly minimal. We call this situation a low fiscal multiplier. In this case, an additional dollar of federal infrastructure aid is going to generate close to $0 in additional GDP, because we're simply taking a worker from one type of project and putting them on a different type of project. However, when GDP is below potential, there are a lot of workers who would otherwise not be working. Hiring a construction worker to build a bridge in this scenario is less likely to take him away from building something else, like an apartment building, an office building, or a house. In this case, someone who would have been unemployed is now working. A job has been saved. This is reflected in higher GDP. Not only that, but since this person has a job, he or she will be spending more money on groceries, clothes, or other services. This leads to generating more jobs that might have otherwise been lost, and this is reflected in a higher fiscal multiplier. Okay. Relying on a number of studies of fiscal multipliers, we find that $1 in federal spending on infrastructure when the economy is below potential will generate $1.20 in GDP. And so this really, just to reiterate, this is only going to apply to the first $300 billion worth of federal infrastructure aid. Above that, new jobs are probably not going to be generated, as the states are not ready to sort of absorb this additional infrastructure aid. Okay, so going back to our earlier analysis, we find that this higher multiplier could apply to as much as $300 billion worth of aid, and therefore $300 billion per year spent on federal infrastructure would increase GDP by as much as $360 billion per year. However, after the recession ends, this short-term effect will disappear. On the other side, this $360 billion does not include the future productivity gains that will be realized once the construction of these infrastructure projects are completed. Okay, so now we're just going to sum up what we've learned here about infrastructure projects and give some lessons or some sort of takeaways, some key takeaways from our analysis. Okay, so successful infrastructure projects generally embody two main features. First, the plan needs to incentivize states and local governments to continue investing in infrastructure. This is best done with federal aid such as tax credits and loan programs that decrease the cost of building new infrastructure. Secondly, the plan must be financed with the fewest distortions possible. User fees are typically a good choice because they don't change households' incentives to save and work. If user fees are not an option, and sometimes they are not, distortionary taxes are the next best choice. We could see that in the analysis of the Senate Democrat plan. The worst choice is financing by borrowing the money and raising deficits. Financing infrastructure with more borrowing leads to lower private capital, which typically offsets the positive effects of infrastructure investment. Infrastructure investment can also provide a short-term boost to GDP during a recession. Each dollar of federal aid during a recession can generate as much as $1.20 in higher GDP. This helps to mitigate the economic decline. The downside to this approach, however, is that there's a limit to the amount of short-term stimulus that this aid can provide. There is only so much money that state and local governments can spend on infrastructure in the short term. Infrastructure investment during the recessions will have a larger total economic effects. It will have both the short-term effects as well as the long-term effects. However, this type of aid is also unlikely to lead to development of new infrastructure project investments, at least in the short term. Only this aid will principally allow states and local governments to continue construction of projects that were already under development. Okay. Thank you very much, and I guess we're going to questions now.
Thank you, John. So far we just have one question, and it is, are there distributional effects from the distortion of a decrease in private capital from higher taxes or deficit spending to people with different incomes?
So I apologize, I missed the beginning of that question. Can you repeat the question because I missed it?
Yeah, sure. So the question is, are there distributional effects from the distortion of a decrease in private capital from higher taxes or deficit spending to people with different incomes?
Oh, absolutely. There are definitely distributional effects. They're very difficult to sort of catalog without actually going through and running the experiment. I mean, so for example, if you increase the taxes on capital income, the taxes are principally going to fall on people who have a lot of money, who have capital income. So those taxes will directly affect probably the wealthier individuals, people who own capital, productive capital. But that's not to say that the effects stop there, because lower capital makes wages small. As we saw from our analysis, lower capital leads to lower wages as well. So this is a really good question because it has a lot of different facets to it. And so lower wages are ultimately also going to impact lower income people, or people who rely principally on wages. The distribution or who is affected most, you really have to look at the numbers. And Penn Wharton budget model does have tools to do those types of distributional effects, although I haven't shown or done any of those types of distributional effects for the 2018 analysis. No, that's an excellent question, and there are clearly a lot of different distributional effects, and you really have to be careful exactly what the particulars of the plan are, because they could change dramatically depending on the type of taxes, and the type of taxes could have dramatically different effects on who is affected by these programs.
Great. And another question also came in, and that one is. Oh, and we have a third too. So exciting.
Excellent.
Okay, so the second question is, how do you determine whether GDP is near potential, and how does this affect whether deficits cause crowding out or crowding in?
Oh, that's also an excellent question. GDP is close to potential. Usually, so the Congressional Budget Office has an estimate of potential GDP. And so generally, if GDP is near that number, then we consider the economy at potential. Obviously, in every quarter, GDP is going to move around a bit, so it's never going to exactly hit potential. And the estimates of potential GDP are just that. They're just estimates. But the things you should look for are like low unemployment rate. So, if your unemployment rate is below 5, if you're at 4.5 or 4 or 3, you're definitely at least at potential. The key there is that if the unemployment rate is that low, you're going to be, taking somebody to build a bridge or taking somebody to work on a government project is almost certainly going to take them away from some private endeavor. And so in that case, there's probably going to be a very low fiscal multiplier. You're probably not going to be creating new GDP because you're not going to be creating new jobs. You're simply going to be moving people from one job over to the other. And so, sorry, I lost track. What was the second half of that question?
The second half is, how does this affect whether deficits cause crowding out or crowding in the model?
Okay, so in the model, deficits always cause crowding out because you're always taking money and taking it away from somebody's savings. Like people are saving an amount of money, and then that money has to get split between private capital and government debt. And so the higher government debt goes, the more money is being taken away from private capital. However, you can still have a very positive GDP effect. Like before, if we had government, if you're creating new jobs, that's going to have a positive GDP effect. And in this case, in our analysis of the 2020 program, this is going to have a much bigger effect than the crowd out that you're going to see in the short run. I mean, we said $300 billion worth of infrastructure investment here is going to generate about $360 billion worth of additional output. And this is definitely going to be much more output than you would lose from the crowd out effect. In addition, however, is that if you have a big short-term effect, like if you're creating $360 billion worth of additional GDP, that's going to also be reflected in higher tax receipts and tax revenue. So that's going to offset a little bit of the debt effect because the government is now going to be pulling in tax revenue that they otherwise would not have. The person working on the bridge is making an income, and they have a job that they otherwise would not have had, so they're probably going to be paying Social Security taxes and income taxes that otherwise would have been lost. So some of the debt is, some of the crowd out is actually offset simply by having higher revenues than you would have had there been no infrastructure plan.
All right, I think you just froze for me for a second.
Oh, sorry there.
Are you there, John? Yeah, great.
Sure.
All right, okay, next question is, thank you for that, by the way. What makes a project shovel-ready, and how do you estimate how many shovel-ready projects are out?
That's an excellent question. So when we're talking about the short-term effects, we're talking about projects, like roads being built or something like that, and the what's happening there is that state and local governments are slowing down their infrastructure projects. They're not doing things that they had planned to do originally because they don't have the revenue to finance these projects. They're looking to get any revenue that they can in order to meet their immediate and emergency. So those projects are also shovel ready because they were all already planned, they were all ready to go, and they were just waiting for the states to spend money. So those things are completely, federal aid can step in and immediately take the place of state infrastructure, state and local infrastructure spending with no delay. Other shovel-ready projects, there are definitely some of them. It's difficult always to estimate how many. It sort of depends on the plan itself. Things like education are definitely not going to be shovel-ready projects. I mean, you have to wait for the students to get to the grade where the project or the investment is going to take place. But there are some projects that are just that are sort of waiting funding. The states have to spread out their spending over a couple of years, and so there may be several projects or a number of projects in each state that are just they're sort of waiting their turn, and this can sort of expedite the beginning of the construction of these projects or the beginning of these investments. We usually, when we do our analysis, we usually do more than one type of schedule. We do the baseline CBO schedule, and then we'll also do the analysis based on sort of like an expedited schedule where you're using most shovel-ready projects. So it's not always easy to tell, and the way we get around doing that is we'll often present the results from both types of analysis. Did I lose you, Sophia?
Great. Oh, there. Yeah. All right. I think that's all we have for now.
Okay.
Any last-minute questions? Now's the time to submit them. In the meantime, I'll keep my eye on that just in case anyone has anything else. But
Okay.
in the meantime, thank you all for coming to our 4th elective and our 7th course in the certificate program. So as you all know, there are 6 course requirements to the program, and many of you have completed them already. If you have any questions about your credits, feel free to email me anytime and I can give you an update. And we will send out information about the certificate distribution for those of you who have completed the requirements for the certificate soon, today or early next week. So be sure to keep an eye out on your email for that. And again, feel free to send us questions anytime. It looks like we have one more question in. John, if you're up for it.
I'm here. Yep.
All right. So anyone else want to take a stab at questions? Now's the time. We're doing a couple more. So this one is, what are the confidence intervals for the low, medium, and high projections?
Okay. So now I just stopped sharing my screen, of course. Bring this back up here. So there are a lot of different dimensions on which we have uncertainty here. So I'm going to pick one. So can you
John,
guys see
it
the
looks
slide?
like I have your blue jeans.
Oh, okay. Is it back up here?
Not on my screen, it's not.
Oh, disappointing. Yeah, I'm losing it here.
There it is. I see it now.
Oh, okay. I lost again. Okay. So there are many different dimensions on which we have confidence intervals. The first one here is the one I showed you, and that's on the different types of infrastructure spending. And so for block grants, for example, we have, block grants, depending on what they are, could generate anywhere between $0 and a full dollar worth of new total infrastructure spending. So 0 is when the federal government completely displaces state spending. Maybe the state was going to build a road, and the federal government's like, we'll build that road instead for you. So that results in no new infrastructure spending. On the other side, maybe the federal government is giving money to these people for something they completely never would have otherwise built. There are several examples of bridges and stuff that the state governments were just not going to build. And so that's the top end of this confidence interval. And so you can see that we have confidence intervals across 5 different types of projects here. And we apply this to all the different components of the infrastructure project. Confidence intervals are also applied to the productivity. So I told you that average productivity is about 12% here for public capital. We consider alternate scenarios where it's 6 cents on the dollar or 24 cents on the dollar. There's a lot of uncertainty on that, and in particular, the projects themselves have a ton of uncertainty. So, this is an average productivity across a variety of projects, and it's entirely possible that some types of investments may be far more productive than others. So, it's important to consider different types of different levels of productivity there. Trying to think, there are other dimensions as well. So, I think, is there anything else we have as well? We have. I mean, it's not explicitly a confidence interval, but we use different speeds for the timing of the investment and the time to build and the time to spend. I mean, the slow one is the CBO one because that embodies a whole bunch of different projects like education, which take forever. But the short term, sorry, my phone keeps ringing here. But we also want to consider, certain types of infrastructure proposals may be aimed at types of projects that just move faster. Things that are quote shovel ready, or other projects that just don't take as long to build. And so we do analysis over a couple different types of time to build scenarios as well. So we don't have explicit confidence intervals, but we do a lot of, I guess, what we call robustness checking, a sensitivity analysis, where we're evaluating a whole bunch of different programs over a wide range of possible possibilities, so that we can really get a sense of what the type of range of effects these programs may have. And we usually publish these. You can see the tables have drop-down menus so that you can see the effects under different types of scenarios.
Great. And it looks like we just got one more also. I guess you're really making everyone think.
That's fun.
Yeah. All right. So this one is, how does government investment in infrastructure projects affect bank credit creation to private firms in the model?
We don't explicitly model the banks in there, so we assume that. Sorry, let me step back for a second. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't. The banks don't really intersect with the infrastructure investment very much. I mean, the key feature here is that if we have a program with sort of loan guarantees or something that affects banks lending, is that ultimately what we care about is the price of investment to state and local governments. So we're saying maybe the federal government has an ability basically to lower the cost of funds. So they're going to make it cheaper for people to borrow from banks. This, again, it doesn't really have much impact on private because private agencies or private businesses are still going to work the same way they did before. But the state and local governments are going to be paying less. They're going to get loans faster, they're going to get them easier, and they're going to get them at lower interest rates, which is effectively going to make the investment in infrastructure cheaper for them. But no, in the model, we don't explicitly model the banking sector right now and how it interacts with private businesses or even the government. We model everything through the amount of total infrastructure that we're going to get for a given amount of federal aid.
Great. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, guys. I really appreciate the questions, too. They're really good.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, for these great questions. And be sure to fill out a feedback form on the website. An email will go out with that link. And of course, we'll email out a recording of this event as well if you want to return to any of the content that we covered. So one last thank you to Jon for the excellent presentation. Thank you to everyone for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you next month.